In 587 BC, Judea was physically erased. Jerusalem was destroyed, its borders dissolved, and the Israelites scattered into Babylon as landless exiles. The destruction of the temple triggered a specific theological crisis. For centuries, the physical sanctuary in Jerusalem was understood as the literal dwelling place of God on earth. Without that structure, the primary mechanism for God's presence among his people had vanished. This loss was total, but Ezekiel's earlier prophecies insisted that Jerusalem's fortunes would one day be restored. The question for the exiles was how a nation could exist without defined borders, an operational capital, or a functioning king to govern them. Ezekiel 47 and 48 answer that question. These chapters function as a rigorous, mathematically precise architectural and geographical master plan for a restored nation. Ezekiel designs this new Israel to resolve a central theological paradox: how a perfectly holy, transcendent God can actively live among a flawed physical society. The solution relies on strict spatial geometry. A meticulously detailed spatial blueprint was required to lock these new boundaries into place. By mathematically separating the sacred from the secular, the design ensures that the political and religious corruptions of the past cannot be repeated. The vision begins with the prophet Ezekiel, positioned at the threshold of the newly drafted temple building. A trickle of water emerges from that threshold. The route is highly specific. It flows out, detours strictly to the south to avoid the central sacrificial altar, and finally exits the complex through the eastern gatehouse. This water defies physical laws. An angelic guide measures the stream at exact 600-yard intervals. At each marker, the volume of water grows exponentially, despite the total absence of rainfall, tributary streams, or natural runoff. Ezekiel wades into the current. First, the water reaches his ankles, then his knees, then his waist, until it swells into an impassable river. This river cuts straight through the historically barren terrain of the Judean wilderness. Its banks immediately sprout fruit trees that never lose their leaves, yielding a continuous monthly supply of food and medicinal treatment. The river eventually empties into the Dead Sea. The Hebrew text specifies that the stagnant waters are healed, a term indicating a restoration of vitality that goes beyond simple desalination. This healing converts a hyper-saline ecosystem into a freshwater lake, capable of supporting dense populations of fish and sustaining a new fishing economy. There is one deliberate, pragmatic exception to this restoration. The swamps and marshes along the edge of the sea are left salty. The temple requires a constant supply of salt for its sacrificial rites, and these unhealed perimeters provide it. For the exiles listening in Babylon, this mental image of a dead landscape erupting into life provided immediate psychological anchor points, securing their hope for a physical return. The temple acts as a localized, insulated engine. By containing absolute holiness within its geometric walls, it unilaterally powers the regional and ecological restoration of an entire land. The national borders are redrawn. The eastern frontier is pulled sharply inward, snapping exactly to the Jordan River and removing the historical Transjordan territories from the nation. This retraction relies on a specific theological precedent. It reverts the eastern boundary back to the ancient standards laid out in the Book of Numbers, chapter 34. While the east is restricted, the western frontier is extended. The border stretches the nation's territory entirely to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The interior of the land is partitioned into 12 equal 8-mile-wide latitudinal strips, running straight from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. In historical Israel, tribal land allocation was proportional to population. Larger tribes received massive territories, while smaller clans received fractions of land, leading to deep political imbalances and the exploitation of weaker tribes. Imposing geometric equality acts as a structural corrective. By granting every tribe the exact same 8-mile strip, the blueprint removes the larger tribe's political leverage and enforces parity across the entire nation. Within this equalized grid, verses 22 and 23 grant resident aliens full land inheritance rights. These non-Israelites living in the land are legally elevated to the same status as natural-born citizens. Ezekiel's map reorders the social structure of the nation, using spatial boundaries to eliminate systemic poverty and the historical marginalization of the landless. In the center of these tribal strips sits a massive dedicated square block known as the Central Reservation. The reservation is subdivided into 3 horizontal zones. The top tier is the priestly domain, which houses the temple. The middle tier belongs to the Levites, and the bottom tier is dedicated to the city. This layout forces a crucial architectural separation. The temple is no longer located inside the city. It is mathematically isolated within its own holy buffer sector, physically removed from the urban population. Flanking the east and west sides of this central reservation are the crown lands, territory assigned exclusively to the prince, the new king. These crown lands are an exercise in political engineering. They provide the king with vast property to satisfy his royal status, while legally and spatially preventing him from seizing his subjects' land, an abuse common among pre-exilic monarchs. The 12 tribal strips surrounding this reservation are ordered by patriarchal hierarchy. The descendants of Jacob's primary wives are granted the land closest to the holy center, while the descendants of his concubines are placed at the furthest northern and southern borders. This arrangement resolves centuries of internal conflict. It takes the historically divided northern and southern kingdoms and pulls them into a single, centralized orbit around the reservation. The zoning layout succeeds on multiple fronts. It balances political power, respects patriarchal tradition, and spatially insulates God's absolute holiness from both secular society and royal corruption. The final details of the blueprint focus on the city zone at the bottom of the central reservation. The perimeter of this new city forms a perfect square, punctuated by 12 distinct gates, 3 on each side. While the massive land strips used secular tribes, like Ephraim and Manasseh, these 12 gates are named for Jacob's actual sons, bringing Levi and Joseph back. By naming the gates after all the original sons, the architecture asserts that the city belongs equally to the entire population. It operates as a microcosm of the whole nation. This layout fulfills the promise of restoration recorded earlier. The city's fortunes are recovered not through wealth or conquest, but through a new spatial identity. Yet the theological tension remains visible on the map. The city has been physically severed from the temple. The dwelling place of God is kept at a mathematical distance to protect his transcendent holiness from human flaw. Despite this physical separation, the very last verse of the book assigns the city a new title. It is no longer called Jerusalem. It is named Yahweh Shammah, meaning the Lord is there. The blueprint achieves its ultimate goal. God's absolute holiness is protected within the isolated sanctuary, securing his transcendence. Yet, through the river of blessing and the naming of the secular city, his presence actively saturates the people. The exiles are left with a perfected blueprint for a restored society.